Humanity had always been the optimist among the stars, believing in peace as the way forward. When they first reached out to other civilizations, they came with open hands and bright eyes, hoping to build connections with those who shared the same vision of cooperation and progress. They spoke of mutual understanding and the betterment of all species across the galaxy. For centuries, humanity had worked toward this lofty goal, meeting alien species on a variety of worlds, building networks of trust and collaboration. They believed in diplomacy as their first weapon, and it had worked for the most part. Their allies were diverse, but united in the dream of a peaceful galaxy. But in the darkness between the stars, there were those who did not share such a vision. The Zorath Empire was one such force, cold, ruthless, and pragmatic. Their approach was simple domination through fear and force. For them, there was no place for diplomacy, no place for negotiation, no place for mercy. The Zorath viewed all other life as weak and expendable beneath their superior might. The first encounter with the Zorath had been cautious. A diplomatic envoy was sent by humanity to make contact, and they arrived on the grand Zorath homeworld, eager to learn and extend the hand of peace. The humans stood in front of the Zorath warlords, offering knowledge and resources, hoping that such goodwill would be reciprocated. But the Zorath Empire had no interest in any of it. They looked down on the humans as little more than ants scurrying around their grand empire, a nuisance that would be easily swept aside when the time came. The meeting ended in cold silence, with no promise for future collaboration. But humanity did not give up. They returned to their worlds and continued their efforts to maintain peace across the galaxy, hoping that others would join them in the fight for a better future. And for a time there was hope. Humanity's allies grew stronger, and they found themselves at the forefront of an alliance that spanned hundreds of worlds. But despite all the progress, there were whispers in the shadows of something darker, something hidden from the gaze of the peaceful societies they had built. Humanity did not yet know what the Zorath were planning, but they would soon find out. The first signs of trouble came quietly. A handful of border worlds began to report strange ships appearing in their skies. At first, there was confusion and concern. Was it a new enemy, or perhaps an unknown faction trying to assert their dominance? But when the first world fell, when the first signal went dark, and the human colony of New Eden was lost, the truth became clear. The Zorath had come, and their intentions were far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. No warning, no negotiation, just pure, brutal force. The humans could not understand why at first. It made no sense to them. How could a species that had once been contacted with such diplomacy resort to such savage acts? Was this a statement, or was it simply the way the Zorath operated? The truth was something worse than they had feared. The Zorath saw humanity as an obstacle, a species that needed to be wiped out, not because they posed any real threat, but because their existence was a challenge to the Empire's ideals. And so humanity had been targeted for no reason other than their presence. The annihilation of New Eden was no mistake. It was the beginning of a brutal campaign, one that would soon spread to every corner of human space. The peaceful ideals humanity had worked so hard to build had become a weapon against them. Their efforts at diplomacy had not been a shield, but a weakness. The Zorath were coming, and humanity had no choice but to respond or be erased from the galaxy forever. When the message from New Eden reached Earth, it was nothing more than a cold transmission of broken data, a desperate plea for help followed by static, and then silence. The Council on Earth listened in stunned disbelief, the faces of diplomats and military leaders frozen in shock. They had been warned, but they had not believed it. The Zorath Empire had been a distant threat, one they thought they could avoid or reason with. But now it was clear that their worst fears had come true. Humanity's ideals of peace and diplomacy had done nothing to protect them, nothing to keep the galaxy from becoming a battlefield. This wasn't just an attack, it was a declaration of war. But it wasn't a war fought for territory or resources. It was a war fought out of pure hatred. The Zorath were not simply looking to conquer humanity, they were seeking to erase them entirely, to wipe them from the stars, as if they had never existed. And at that moment, humanity realized they had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated their enemy. In every way they had believed that civilization and goodwill could stand against brutality and savagery, but they had been wrong now. A cold, hard truth settled over them. Humanity had been given no choice. The response would be one of survival, not diplomacy. The council convened in a secret meeting. Military leaders and strategists took control of the room, their voices echoing with urgency. They knew that any hesitation would be their undoing. The time for negotiation was over. Peace would not come through submission, it would come through retaliation. And so a new plan was set in motion. Earth's military began mobilizing faster than anyone had thought possible. The fleet that had once been used to explore new worlds now turned to war with an efficiency that stunned even their own people. Weapons were developed at an unprecedented rate. Old systems were upgraded to make them more deadly, and soldiers trained in new tactics, ready to fight against an enemy that was unlike anything they had ever faced. Every soldier knew that this was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight to show the galaxy that humanity could not and would not be pushed around. The first response was swift. The human fleet launched from Earth in coordinated waves aimed directly at Zorath colonies. The attack was precise, brutal, but not without purpose. Humanity did not waste their resources on unnecessary destruction. Every move was calculated, every strike intentional. Their ships were faster, more agile than the Zorath's lumbering war vessels, and their tactics had evolved beyond anything the Zorath had expected. Humanity was not just responding to the attack on New Eden. They were sending a message that would be heard across the stars. They were no longer the peaceful species who could be reasoned with. They were a species who would defend their own, and they would stop at nothing to do so. The first battle was over almost before the Zorath realized it had begun. The human fleet hit like a storm and then disappeared into the darkness of space, leaving behind a trail of broken ships and wreckage. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer a species to be taken lightly. They were no longer the innocent explorers they once were. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the Zorath had just awakened a sleeping giant. But in the shadow of victory, the humans knew that this was only the beginning. They had fought one battle, but the war was just starting, and there was no telling what the Zorath would do in response to their newfound enemies. As the first wave of humanity's retaliation reached the far corners of Zorath space, the gravity of what had been set into motion became apparent across Earth. Leaders convened once again in an emergency session, but this time there was no debate over what must be done. They knew the stakes, and they knew the cost. There was no turning back now. They could not simply let the Zorath continue their campaign of destruction without risking the total collapse of everything humanity had built for centuries. No longer could they afford to cling to ideals of peace in the face of such brutality. The diplomats who once advocated for negotiation were silent now, and even the military leaders who had spoken of restraint found themselves standing at the precipice of a new war, a war where mercy had no place. In the beginning, there had been a thought, a hope that perhaps they could find a way to negotiate a ceasefire or force the Zorath into retreat by showing them humanity's strength, but that hope had died with the obliteration of New Eden. The council was left with only one option. They had to fight. They had to fight not just to defend their homes, but to send a message to every empire across the galaxy that humanity would never be eradicated like some insignificant insect. It was clear now. The Zorath Empire had no intention of negotiating, no matter how powerful humanity's response was, no matter how much damage they caused. The Zorath would not stop until humanity was nothing more than a footnote in the history of the galaxy, and that was something humanity could never accept. In the dead of night, on military stations across the planet, the human fleet began to regroup. Their soldiers took to their ships with renewed purpose, their weapons now loaded and ready for war. The War Council gave their orders, and humanity set out to strike not only the Zorath's military outposts, but their heart, the great capital planets of their empire. The strategy was brutal but necessary. They would not just defend their colonies, they would hunt the Zorath down to the core of their empire and show them that there was no hiding from humanity's wrath. Every colony that had fallen to the Zorath was marked for revenge. Every soldier who had perished in the Zorath's genocidal purge would be avenged. Humanity's retaliation was no longer defensive. It was a promise of destruction in the depths of the war room. General Harper looked out across the assembly of officers, every face grim with the realization of what would come next. In many ways, this was no longer a fight for survival. This was a fight for the soul of humanity, for the right to exist, for the very future of their species. Harper clenched his fists and turned to the table filled with maps and tactical plans. His voice was firm and clear. We tried being civilized, but no more. We fight now for the future of humanity, for the future of all those who still believe in the values we hold dear. We fight so the Zorath will never make this mistake again. His words resonated throughout the room, and for the first time since New Eden fell, there was no doubt humanity would do whatever it took to win. It wasn't just about stopping the Zorath. It was about sending a message to the rest of the galaxy, to those who would dare to follow in their footsteps. Humanity was no longer the species that looked the other way. Humanity would no longer be a target. Humanity would stand tall or die fighting to protect what they believed in. Humanity's fleet surged across the stars with a fury that was impossible to ignore. Their ships moved in unison, cutting through space with precision and speed as they entered the heart of Zorath territory. The attack was swift and brutal, designed not just to strike at their enemies, but to send a shockwave throughout the galaxy that would reverberate for years to come. The human fleet had undergone a transformation since the first wave of retaliation. They had learned from their early encounters with the Zorath. They knew that it wasn't just strength in numbers that mattered, it was the ability to adapt quickly, to anticipate the enemy's next move, and above all to hit hard and fast without warning. The Zorath had expected humanity's response to be slow and disorganized, but they were wrong. The first assault on the Zorath's outer defenses was a spectacle of precision. The human fleet had grown smarter in its tactics, using guerrilla warfare in the vastness of space. Their ships would appear out of nowhere, strike at critical points, and then vanish into the shadows of deep space, leaving the Zorath fleet to scramble in chaos. But this was only the beginning. Humanity had something the Zorath did not. They had the element of surprise. Their technology was not just advanced, it was evolving every day. New strategies and weapons were being developed faster than the Zorath could react. Each ship was a perfect machine, a tool of war fine-tuned for maximum effectiveness. Humanity's ships were equipped with faster engines, more powerful weapons, and shields that had been improved through years of research. Each crew member had undergone grueling training specifically for this fight, and it showed as they executed every attack with deadly efficiency. The Zorath responded with fury, but their attempts to retaliate fell short. Their ships were larger but slower, and their tactics were outdated compared to the lightning-fast strikes of humanity's fleet. Every time they attempted to regroup, the humans were already on the move again, hitting new targets before they could react to the last. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were dismantling the entire structure of the Zorath Empire piece by piece. With every attack, they took out crucial military bases, space stations, and supply depots, cutting off the Zorath's ability to fight effectively. In the midst of it all, humanity didn't just bring their technology to the battlefield. They brought their will to win. The human forces were not just soldiers. They were brothers and sisters united by the same cause. Their bonds of loyalty to each other and to their people were what fueled their unrelenting charge across the stars. While the Zorath fought for control and power, humanity fought for something much deeper. They fought for their homes, their families, their very survival. And that was a power the Zorath could never understand and never hope to match. Each victory became a rallying cry across the galaxy. The human fleet struck so fast and hard that soon there were whispers of their triumphs reaching other corners of the galaxy. Species who had once looked on humanity as a weak and naive species now saw them as something else, a force to be reckoned with. And the Zorath knew they had made a terrible mistake. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, and now they would pay the price. But the humans were not done yet. Their first wave was only the start. The war was far from over, and they knew it would take everything they had to see it through. But as they continued their relentless advance, humanity's message was loud and clear. They would never be erased from the stars. They would never go quietly into the dark. and they would make the Zorath regret ever crossing them. The Zorath were not used to failure. Their empire had thrived on domination and fear for centuries. They had crushed entire species without hesitation, and those who survived learned to bend the knee. But now they faced something they had never encountered before. Humanity was not afraid. They had struck hard and fast, with no mercy, and now the Zorath found themselves struggling to maintain control over their own empire. The first wave of human attacks had left deep scars in the Zorath military infrastructure, and as the humans continued their assault, the Zorath realized they were being pushed to the brink. In their desperation, they called upon their most elite warriors, the Terran hunters. These soldiers were unlike any the Zorath had ever faced. They were genetically enhanced and trained in every form of combat imaginable. Their ships were some of the most advanced in the galaxy, and they had been unleashed in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. But what the Zorath did not understand was that humanity had already anticipated this move. The Terran hunters were formidable, but they were not invincible. Humanity had learned the Zorath's tactics and adapted their own strategies to counter them. Every time the Terran hunters would strike, humanity would respond with even more deadly precision. Their ships, now equipped with countermeasures specifically designed to disrupt the Zorath's most advanced weapons technology, allowed humanity to neutralize the elite soldiers before they could inflict major damage. The battle that followed was one of the most intense the humans had faced, but they held their ground with determination. And when the dust settled, the Terran hunters had been shattered. Humanity's fleet surged forward again, this time with even greater intensity. Knowing they could taste victory, their strategy was no longer just about hitting the enemy hard. It was about making sure the Zorath had no place to retreat, no place to regroup. They were striking at the heart of Zorath space, cutting down everything that fueled their empire, from their military bases to their power sources. They weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to dismantle the very foundation of the Zorath's power. Their commanders had known that to defeat the Zorath once and for all, they needed to eliminate any possibility of their resurgence. And so humanity's forces turned their sights to the Zorath capital planets, where the ruling class hid behind walls of protection. On these worlds, the warlords and their fleets gathered to regroup and plan their next move. But they underestimated the reach and persistence of humanity's fleet. They had thought themselves safe, protected by layers of defense. But humanity had learned to strike where it hurt most. No longer would they wait for the Zorath to come to them. They would bring the fight to their doorstep. The Zorath capital planet was surrounded by a heavily fortified defense grid that seemed impossible to penetrate, but humanity had discovered a vulnerability within the grid, an opening that would allow them to strike directly at the heart of the Zorath Empire. And they did just that. With a coordinated strike, they tore through the defenses and entered the capital's atmosphere. The Zorath attempted to rally their forces, but it was too late. Humanity was already there, and they were not leaving without securing their victory. The battle for the Zorath capital was fierce, but every moment the human forces gained ground, and with every Zorath warship destroyed, another piece of their empire fell into the hands of the humans. The Zorath commanders realized the truth far too late. Humanity was not just a species to be eradicated. They were a species that would fight and fight until every last breath had been drawn. And the Zorath were finally beginning to see that they had made their final mistake. The tide of battle had shifted, and the Zorath now found themselves scrambling to defend their crumbling empire. The once feared fleet that had struck terror into the hearts of countless species was no longer a symbol of invincibility. It had become a fractured force, fighting a losing war. The human fleet now had them cornered, their ships moving with an unrelenting precision that left the Zorath generals scrambling to mount any sort of effective counterattack. Humanity's relentless pursuit of victory had taken a toll on the Zorath psyche. The warlords who had once ruled with iron fists now cowered behind their walls of power, watching as their empire was slowly unraveled. The human fleet continued to press forward without mercy, and with each new victory came more urgency for the Zorath to regroup and retaliate. But the humans were everywhere. They struck from all directions, and the Zorath could not keep up. The sheer speed and adaptability of humanity's forces were unmatched. Their ability to improvise and evolve on the fly made them unpredictable and nearly impossible to pin down. They no longer relied on traditional tactics. Humanity's forces were now working in small specialized units that operated independently from the larger fleet. They would infiltrate Zorath-controlled systems, disable key infrastructure, and then vanish into the stars before the Zorath could even respond. The Zorath began to panic, sending waves of forces to chase down these rogue units, only to find themselves drawn further and further into humanity's trap. Each time the Zorath attempted to reorganize their fleet, the humans would strike somewhere else, taking out vital resources and leaving the Zorath even weaker than before. The humans knew they could not afford to give the Zorath time to recover. They had to keep up the pressure or risk giving their enemies the chance to rebuild and retaliate. They had already seen the horrors the Zorath could inflict, and they knew that if the Empire was allowed to regroup, the war could stretch on indefinitely. The human fleet moved with even more focus, now targeting the heart of the Zorath's power. Their attacks were no longer just against their fleet, but against their ability to wage war at all. Humanity had found a way to break the Zorath's communications network and disrupt their command structure. Their fleets no longer knew where to strike and when, and that confusion began to tear the Zorath apart from within. Their leadership was fragmented and infighting became rampant as the Zorath warlords blamed each other for the growing disaster. The Empire's grip on its remaining territory weakened with every passing day, and soon the humans turned their attention to the Zorath's final bastion. Their capital world was heavily fortified, but humanity knew how to breach it. The human fleet surrounded the planet, cutting off any means of escape, and began their final push. They attacked in waves, targeting key military installations and communications hubs. The battle for the Zorath capital was fierce, but humanity's forces were relentless and overwhelming. With each hour that passed, the Zorath's defenses grew weaker. Their last line of resistance crumbled under the pressure of humanity's sheer will and determination. The Zorath realized far too late that they were no longer fighting an enemy they could easily crush. They were fighting for their lives against a species that had discovered the true cost of survival and the price of justice. They had underestimated humanity, and now it was too late to turn the tide. In the final hours of the Zorath Empire's existence, as their last strongholds fell one by one, the Zorath leadership convened in their underground bunkers on their capital planet. Their once proud warlords sat in silence, staring at the holographic maps of the galaxy before them, watching as humanity's fleet moved inexorably toward their final fortress. They knew they were beaten. The question now was how long they could stave off the inevitable. They had underestimated humanity. At every turn, their belief that their superiority would guarantee victory had been shattered by the unyielding tenacity of the human race. The Zorath had always ruled with fear and violence. They had believed that their strength alone could crush any opposition, but what they had failed to account for was the spirit of humanity and the resolve that came with it. The human fleet was everywhere. It was a storm that could not be avoided or reasoned with. The Zorath could no longer rely on their vast numbers. Their warships were falling faster than they could replace them, and the final defenses of their capital planet were beginning to crumble. They sent every last fighter they had into the skies, desperate to hold back the tide, but it was futile. Humanity's ships moved through the skies like shadows, striking with precision and leaving nothing behind but destruction. The Zorath forces could not keep up. Their battle strategies had become predictable, their ships too slow and their commanders too desperate to adapt to the ever-changing tactics of the human fleet. They had thought they would destroy humanity's spirit by killing millions, but they had awakened something much fiercer in return. Humanity was not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for every life lost to the Zorath. They were fighting to ensure no species would ever suffer the same fate again. In the midst of the chaos, the Zorath commanders were forced to face the truth. They had brought this upon themselves. They had thought themselves gods of the galaxy, but now they were nothing more than a dying empire grasping at straws, trying to avoid extinction. But there was no escape. The final assault on the Zorath capital came with a crushing force. The human fleet descended upon the planet with everything they had left. They tore through the last layers of defense and made their way toward the heart of the Zorath stronghold. As their ships descended, the Zorath leaders gave their final orders to launch a last-ditch attempt at retaliation. They unleashed their most advanced weapon systems, hoping to turn the tide, but humanity had anticipated this. The human fleet had learned to counter every weapon the Zoreth could throw at them with devastating efficiency, and before the Zoreth knew what had happened, their capital was burning, the last of their forces scattered into space like broken pieces of a once mighty empire. But the humans were not finished yet. They could not simply let the Zoreth die quietly, not after everything they had done. They hunted down the last remnants of the Zoreth warlords, who had once ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, and brought them to justice. The Zoreth had fallen, and with their fall came a new understanding of what humanity was capable of. Humanity had been pushed to the brink of annihilation, but now they stood victorious, and the message was clear: no one would ever threaten their people again. No one would ever think they could destroy humanity and get away with it. The victory over the Zoreth did not bring immediate peace. It was a bittersweet triumph for humanity. The cost had been immense, and the scars of war would remain for generations to come. The survivors returned to their homeworlds battered and broken, but with a resolve that had been forged in the fires of their struggle. The galaxy would never be the same again. Humanity had seen the darkness of the universe, and it had changed them. They were no longer the hopeful explorers who sought out peaceful alliances. They had become something else, something harder and more determined. They had learned the true cost of survival, and they would not forget it. The war with the Zoreth had left entire systems devastated, whole colonies reduced to ashes, and families torn apart. Yet even in the wake of such destruction, humanity stood tall. They rebuilt and forged alliances with those who had supported them during the conflict. But there was no turning back from the lessons learned in the fires of war. Peace would never be as simple as it once seemed. The galaxy was still filled with dangers and threats unknown, but now humanity was different. They no longer looked to the stars with naive hope. They looked with wariness and readiness. The defeat of the Zoreth had left a power vacuum that the galaxy's other empires were quick to notice and exploit. Factions once hidden in the shadows now saw an opportunity to rise. The balance of power had shifted, and humanity was no longer the weak species that could be pushed aside. Their enemies and allies alike knew they had gained a strength that was undeniable, but that strength came at a cost. Now every decision would carry the weight of the countless lives lost in the war with the Zoreth. The survivors of New Eden were among the first to return to the front lines to help rebuild what had been lost. But many of them carried the weight of their experiences with them. They were no longer the same people they had been before the war. They were hardened by the horrors they had witnessed, and the friends they had lost. The human spirit was unbroken, but it had been changed as humanity began to rebuild. There were those who questioned whether the price of victory had been worth it. They had defeated the Zoreth, but at what cost? How many lives had been sacrificed? How many families torn apart in the name of survival? There were some who whispered that humanity's victory had come at the expense of their soul, that in fighting to survive they had lost something precious and irretrievable. But those voices were drowned out by the majority who looked to the future with determination. Humanity would continue to push forward. They would rebuild their colonies and defend them against any who would threaten their existence. They would ensure that the horrors they had faced under the Zoreth Empire would never be visited upon them again. Their resolve was ironclad, and as the galaxy continued to turn, they knew that humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through diplomacy or peaceful words, but through the undeniable will to survive, the will to fight, and the will to never back down again. Humanity had been tested, and they had passed the test. They would never again be seen as weak. They would never again be taken for granted. And for all those who had been lost in the war, their memories would live on in every step humanity took toward its future. Years passed since the fall of the Zoreth Empire, and humanity's place in the galaxy had transformed from one of vulnerability to one of undeniable power. The scars of war still lingered in the form of shattered worlds and broken lives. But humanity had rebuilt and adapted. They had not only survived, they had thrived. The galaxy's empires no longer underestimated humanity. They had learned that a single species could reshape the fate of the stars itself. Humanity's presence was felt in every corner of the galaxy, no longer confined to Earth or its colonies. They were everywhere, forging alliances of strength, not kindness, but strength nonetheless. Even the most powerful of galactic empires had learned to tread carefully around them as humanity made its mark and rebuilt from the ashes of war. Humanity's new mission was clear. They would not let the darkness of the galaxy consume them again. They would be the guardians of their people, of all the innocent lives that had been lost in the war. But they were not just fighters now, they were diplomats, strategists, pioneers, forging new paths. Through the stars, the human fleet was now a symbol of resolve. Its ships, more advanced than ever, their crews hardened by years of conflict, but still filled with an unyielding belief in what they had accomplished. Humanity had learned that it was not enough to merely survive. They had to carve out their place in the galaxy and stand firm against any who would try to take that away. The galaxy's other races had learned this lesson the hard way. The remnants of the Zorith Empire had crumbled to dust, but their influence had left a stain on the galaxy, a stain that would not soon fade. And as the years passed, the other empires watched carefully, watching to see if humanity would slip into the same path that had led to the Zorith's downfall. Would they become what they had once fought against? Would they grow too arrogant, too powerful to stay humble? Humanity's leaders knew this was the greatest test they faced: to rebuild, to stay strong without losing the very values that had led them to victory, to remember the cost of their triumph and never forget the lives lost in the name of survival. The human spirit was alive and well, but it was tempered by the lessons of the past. They had seen the consequences of unchecked power. They had seen the destruction it caused, and they swore never to walk that path again. The future was uncertain, but humanity faced it with courage, knowing they had faced their darkest hour and emerged stronger for it. And as the human fleet patrolled the stars, keeping a vigilant watch over their new territories, there was always the understanding that they could not rest on their laurels. There would always be a threat lurking in the shadows, but humanity was ready. They were no longer the naive species that had once looked to the stars with dreams of peaceful exploration. They were warriors, survivors, and they had earned their place among the stars. The galaxy would never forget the day when humanity stood against the Zorith Empire, and the day they proved that no one could ever erase them from the stars.